When Keanu Reeves walked into that forgotten bar on a lonely highway, he just wanted to read in peace while waiting for the storm to pass. What he didn't know was that 5 violent bikers from the Iron Wolves gang were about to turn his quiet evening into the worst nightmare of their lives. It started with mockery about his book, escalated to shoving and public humiliation, and ended with one of them pointing a gun at his chest while screaming death threats. But when he finally spoke those 3 words, it froze everyone's blood. "My name is John Wick." What followed was a display of violence so precise and terrifying that it forever changed the definition of what it means to be a predator. What the security cameras captured that night would become legend in the criminal underworld. And before we dive into this incredible story, tell us what's your favorite Keanu Reeves movie. Let us know in the comments. The Rusty Anchor was the kind of dive bar that existed in every small town across America. Dim lighting, sticky floors, and the perpetual smell of stale beer and cigarettes that had soaked into the wood over decades. Located just off Highway 101, in a forgotten corner of Northern California. It was the type of place where strangers were noticed immediately and welcomed reluctantly. On this particular Friday evening, Keanu Reeves sat alone in the far corner booth, nursing a whiskey and trying to remain invisible. He wore a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and a worn leather jacket, nothing that would mark him as one of Hollywood's biggest stars. His motorcycle helmet sat on the table beside him, and his Triumph Bonneville was parked outside among the Harleys and choppers that belonged to the bar's regular clientele. Keanu had stopped at the Rusty Anchor purely by chance. He'd been riding north for 3 days, taking back roads and avoiding major highways in an attempt to clear his head after wrapping another grueling film shoot. The anonymity of the open road in small-town dive bars provided respite from the constant scrutiny of fame. The bartender, a grizzled man in his 60s named Frank, served him without recognition or conversation beyond asking what he wanted to drink. The handful of locals scattered throughout the bar paid him no attention, which was exactly how Keanu preferred it. He pulled out a worn paperback copy of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations and began reading by the dim light of the booth's overhead lamp. The ancient philosopher's words about inner strength and resilience had always provided comfort during difficult times, and the familiar passages helped him decompress from months of intense action sequences and emotional scenes. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered when the door burst open, and 5 members of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club entered with the swagger of men who believed they owned whatever space they occupied. Their leather vests displayed the club's patchiest snarling wolf's head, surrounded by flames, and their arms were covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and brotherhood. Jake Bulldog Morrison, the club's president, was a mountain of a man standing 6 feet 4, with arms like tree trunks and a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months. His lieutenant, Tommy Snake Rodriguez, was smaller but carried himself with the coiled tension of someone always ready for a fight. The other 3, Rick, Danny, and Pete, followed their leaders like loyal attack dogs, scanning the room for any sign of disrespect or weakness. Bull, Snake elbowed Bulldog. "Check out the bookworm in the corner." Bulldog turned to look at Keanu, who continued reading as if the bikers hadn't entered at all. This lack of acknowledgement was perceived as disrespect, and in the Iron Wolves world, disrespect demanded correction. "Looks like we got ourselves a college boy," Bulldog sneered, "probably lost." Looking for sparks, the comment drew laughter from the other club members, but Keanu didn't react. He simply turned a page in his book and took another sip of his whiskey. His face remaining perfectly calm, Frank, the bartender, felt the tension building and tried to diffuse it. "He's just passing through. Jake, he hasn't caused any trouble yet," Snake added ominously. "Don't." The Iron Wolves had claimed the Rusty Anchor as their territory years ago, and they didn't appreciate outsiders, especially ones who seemed educated or refined. In their experience, such people looked down on bikers, considered them criminals or degenerates. They developed a hair-trigger sensitivity to any perceived slight or condescension. What they didn't know was that the quiet man in the corner booth had spent years training in martial arts, firearms, and tactical combat for his John Wick films. What they couldn't see was that beneath his calm exterior lay the muscle memory of countless fight choreography, sessions and weapons training with some of the world's best stunt coordinators and military advisors. Keanu finished the paragraph. He was reading, glanced up briefly, and met Bulldog's eyes for just a moment, long enough to acknowledge the biker's presence without showing either fear or challenge. Then he returned to his book, a gesture that somehow managed to be both respectful and dismissive at the same time. But the Iron Wolves weren't in the mood for subtlety. They'd been drinking before arriving at the Rusty Anchor, celebrating a successful drug run that had netted them enough money to party for weeks. Their blood was up, their inhibitions were down, and they were looking for entertainment. The quiet stranger in the corner booth was about to become their target, though none of them could have imagined how drastically this night would change their lives and end some of them forever. Snake was the first to make a move. He grabbed his beer and swaggered over to Keanu's booth with the loose-limbed gait of someone who'd been drinking for hours. His boots clicked deliberately on the sticky floor as he approached, each step designed to announce his presence and intimidate. "Watch a reading there, Professor?" Snake asked, leaning against the booth with studied casualness. His breath reeked of alcohol and cigarettes, and there was a mean glint in his bloodshot eyes. Keanu looked up calmly. "Marcus Aurelius, ancient philosophy, ancient philosophy," Snake repeated mockingly, loud enough for his brothers to hear. "Well, ain't that fancy? You hear that, boys? We got ourselves a scholar." The other Iron Wolves chuckled from their spots at the bar, sensing entertainment brewing. Bulldog spun around on his bar stool to get a better view, his massive frame blocking out the dim light from the bar's neon signs. "You know what I think about fancy book learning?" Snake continued, his voice gaining an edge. "I think it's for people who can't handle the real world, people who need to hide behind big words because they ain't got the balls to face reality." Keanu closed his book carefully, using a napkin as a bookmark. His movements were deliberate and calm, showing no sign of agitation despite the obvious provocation. "Everyone finds wisdom in different places," he replied quietly. Marcus Aurelius was actually a warrior emperor. He believed philosophy should guide action, not replace it. The response wasn't what Snake expected. Most people either cowered when confronted by the Iron Wolves, or tried to act tough and escalate the situation. Keanu's calm, educational response threw him off balance and made him feel foolish in front of his brothers. "Are you trying to make me look stupid?" Snake's voice rose dangerously. "Not at all," Keanu said. "I was just sharing what I found interesting about the book." But Snake was past the point of rational conversation. The alcohol, the group dynamics, and his own insecurities had combined into a toxic mix that demanded violence as resolution. "I think you are trying to make me look stupid," Snake said, placing his beer bottle down hard on the table. "I think you're sitting here in our bar, acting all superior with your fancy books and your quiet voice, thinking you're better than us." Double quotes Frank. The bartender cleared his throat nervously. "Snake, maybe shut up." Frank Bulldog growled from the bar. "Let Snake handle his business." The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. What moments before had been a peaceful dive bar was now charged with the electric tension that preceded violence. The few other patrons began quietly finishing their drinks and heading for the door. Recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation, Keanu remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert. Those who knew him well might have noticed the subtle changes, the way his weight had shifted slightly forward, how his hands had moved to rest naturally on the table's edge, the increased focus in his eyes. But to the Iron Wolves, he still looked like an easy target. "You know what I think," Snake continued, emboldened by his brother's attention. and the stranger's apparent passivity. "I think you're in the wrong place. This ain't some coffee shop in Berkeley where you can sit around, reading your little books and feeling superior to working men," Keanu said. "I don't feel superior to anyone. I'm just having a drink and reading while I wait for the rain to stop." "The rain stopped an hour ago," Rick called out from the bar, drawing more laughter from the group. Snake smiled meanly. "Sounds like you're out of excuses, Professor. Maybe it's time you moved along." Keanu looked around the barat, the 5 bikers, at Frank, who was trying to look busy while clearly terrified at the empty bottles and scattered peanut shells that spoke to years of routine violence in this place. He could walk away. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But something in Snake's tone, in the predatory way the iron wolves were circling, told him that leaving might not be an option. "I paid for my drink," Keanu said simply. "I'll finish it and go." Snake's face darkened. The stranger's refusal to be intimidated was making him look weak in front of his brothers, and weakness was not tolerated in the Iron Wolves. "You'll go when I tell you to go," Snake snarled, leaning closer. "And right now, I'm telling you to get the hell out of our bar." The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Frank gripped his baseball bat tighter behind the bar. The Iron Wolves tensed for action, and Keanu Reeves sat perfectly still, making a calculation that would determine whether this night ended with humiliation or bloodshed. But none of them knew that they were about to discover why John Wick was the most feared assassin in the underworld. What happened next would be seared into Frank's memory for the rest of his life. Snake, emboldened by alcohol and the expectant faces of his brothers, decided that words weren't enough. He reached out and knocked Keanu's whiskey glass off the table, sending it crashing to the floor in an explosion of amber liquid and shattered glass. "Oops," Snake said with mock innocence. "Looks like you're done drinking." The sound of breaking glass seemed to flip a switch in the other Iron Wolves. They rose from their bar stools like predators, sensing wounded prey, moving to surround Keanu's booth with the practiced coordination of a pack that had done this many times before. Keanu looked down at the broken glass, then back up at Snake. His expression hadn't changed, but something fundamental had shifted in the air around him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "That was unnecessary," Keanu said quietly. "Unnecessary." Bulldog laughed as he approached, his massive frame casting a shadow over the booth. "You know what's unnecessary? Some fancy boy coming into our place and acting like he owns it." "I haven't acted like I own anything," Keanu replied, his voice still calm, but now carrying an undertone that made Frank's blood run cold. "I've been sitting quietly, reading a book, and minding my own business." "Your business is our business when you're in our territory," Danny chimed in, positioning himself to block any exit route Keanu might consider. Pete, the youngest of the group, was practically vibrating with excitement. This was the kind of action he lived for, the chance to prove himself to his older brothers by participating in the humiliation of some random outsider. "Maybe we should teach him some manners," Pete suggested eagerly. "Good idea," Snake said, smiling with yellowed teeth. "Stand up, Professor. Time for your education." Keanu remained seated, but his posture had subtly changed. What had looked like relaxed casualness now appeared to be coiled potential energy, like a spring compressed and ready to release. "I don't want any trouble," he said. "Too late for that," Snake snarled. "You should have thought about that before you decided to disrespect us." The accusation was absurd. Keanu had done nothing but exist in their presence, but logic had long since abandoned this confrontation. The Iron Wolves were operating on primitive pack dynamics now, and the stranger represented an opportunity to reinforce their dominance through violence. Frank, Frank said nervously. "You got a problem with how we handle our business?" Bulldog warned. The threat was implicit but clear. The Iron Wolves controlled this bar through fear and violence, and Frank's livelihood depended on their tolerance. He looked at Keanu with apologetic eyes, but said nothing more. Snake grabbed the edge of the table and leaned down until his face was inches from Keanu's. I said, "Stand up." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across an invisible line that once crossed would change everything. Snake saw what he expected to see, a soft city boy who would crumble under pressure. But if he'd looked more carefully, he might have noticed the absolute stillness in Keanu's eyes, the way his breathing had become perfectly controlled, the subtle shift in his body language that spoke of someone who had moved beyond fear into a different state entirely. "Please move away from me," Keanu said quietly. The politeness of the request somehow made it more ominous. Snake laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "Or what? You going to call your lawyer? Going to report us to the Better Business Bureau?" The other Iron Wolves laughed, but their mirth felt forced. Something about the stranger's absolute calm was beginning to unnerve them, though they couldn't quite identify what. "I'm asking you politely to step back and let me finish my drink in peace," Keanu said. "This doesn't have to escalate." "It already has escalated," Snake snarled, finally losing patience with the stranger's refusal to show proper fear. He grabbed Keanu's shoulder and tried to pull him out of the booth. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. The moment Snake's hand touched him, Keanu's body exploded into motion with a speed and precision that defied belief. His left hand shot up and grabbed Snake's wrist in a grip that felt like a steel vice, while his right elbow drove upward into the biker's solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The Snake doubled over, gasping for air. But Keanu wasn't finished. In one fluid motion, he rose from the booth, twisted Snake's arm behind his back, and slammed him face first into the table with a force that shook the entire booth. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. The rusty anchor fell into absolute silence. The remaining Iron Wolves stared in shock at their lieutenant, who was now pinned to the table with blood streaming from his nose and making sounds like a wounded animal. Keanu looked up at the other bikers, and for the first time, they saw something in his eyes that made their blood freeze. It wasn't anger or aggression. It was the cold, calculating gaze of a predator evaluating its prey. "I tried to do this the easy way," Keanu said, his voice carrying the authority that filled the room. "But apparently, we're going to do it the hard way." The Iron Wolves were about to discover that they had just attacked the wrong man on the wrong night in the wrong place. I'll continue proofreading and correcting the spelling and grammar mistakes in the text you provided. Here's the continuation of my corrections. The silence that followed Keanu's explosive defense lasted only seconds. But in that brief moment, everything changed. The Iron Wolves, who moments before had been confident predators, now found themselves staring at a man who had just demonstrated a level of skill and control that defied their understanding of violence. Snake lay pinned to the table, his arm twisted at an angle that suggested any movement would result in a break. Blood dripped from his nose onto the scarred wood, and his eyes were wide with a combination of pain and disbelief. The casual ease with which he'd been neutralized shattered his conception of how this confrontation was supposed to go. Keanu held him there effortlessly, his grip precise and unbreakable. But it wasn't the physical dominance that unsettled the other bikers. It was the complete absence of emotion in Keanu's face. He wasn't angry, wasn't breathing hard, wasn't showing any signs of adrenaline or excitement. He looked like a man who had simply handled a minor inconvenience. "Let him go," Bulldog demanded, but his voice lacked the commanding authority it had carried minutes before. For the first time in years, he was facing someone who didn't seem intimidated by his size or reputation. "When you and your friends step back and give me room to leave," Keanu replied calmly. "This ends when you want it to end." It was a reasonable request delivered with absolute authority. Snake whimpered as Keanu adjusted his grip slightly, sending a fresh wave of pain through his twisted arm. Rick, Danny, and Pete looked to Bulldog for guidance, but their president was struggling with a crisis of confidence. The stranger's casual dismantling of Snake had revealed a fundamental truth. They were out of their depth. "You don't know who you're messing with," Danny said, trying to inject threat into his voice. "We're the Iron Wolves. This is our territory." Keanu's eyes shifted to Danny with laser focus. "You don't know who you're messing with either," he replied, "but you're about to find out if you keep pushing." The words were delivered without bluster or theatricality, which somehow made them infinitely more menacing. Danny took an unconscious step backward. Frank watched from behind the bar, his knuckles white as he gripped his baseball bat. In 30 years of running the Rusty Anchor, he'd seen countless bar fights, but nothing like this. The stranger wasn't fighting like a tough guy or a street brawler. He was moving and thinking like someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Pete, young and stupid, and still high on the adrenaline of pack hunting, decided to prove himself. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket and flicked it open with a practiced motion. "Maybe a little steel will change your attitude," he snarled, advancing on Keanu with the knife held low and threatening. The blade's appearance changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. What had been a bar fight was now attempted assault with a deadly weapon. And everyone in the room understood that the stakes had just escalated dramatically. Keanu looked at the knife, then at Pete's face, and something shifted in his expression. The careful control he'd been maintaining began to give way to something much more dangerous. "Put the knife away," he said quietly. "Last warning." Pete laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "Or what? You going to karate chop me like in the movies?" That reference to movies was accidentally prophetic, though Pete had no way of knowing it. He was looking at a man who had spent years training with weapons masters, martial arts experts, and military advisors to portray one of cinema's most lethal assassins. The line between acting and reality had blurred through countless hours of preparation and muscle memory. "Pete," Bulldog said suddenly, sensing that they were approaching a point of no return, "put the blade away." But Pete was young and drunk and desperate to prove himself to his brothers. He feinted with the knife, testing Keanu's reactions. What happened next would be talked about in whispers throughout the biker community for years to come. Keanu released Snake's arm and moved with a fluidity that seemed to bend the laws of physics. His left hand deflected Pete's knife hand, while his right grabbed the young biker's wrist. In one continuous motion, he spun Pete around, using the biker's own momentum against him, and drove him backward into the nearest wall with a force that shook the entire building. The knife clattered harmlessly to the floor as Pete slumped against the wall, dazed and gasping. Blood trickled from where his head had struck the wood paneling. 2 iron wolves down in less than 30 seconds. Snake tried to push himself up from the table, but Keanu's hand pressed down on his neck, holding him in place with minimal effort. "I count for knives, 2 guns, and at least 1 set of brass knuckles among the rest of you," Keanu said conversationally, though his voice carried a new edge that made everyone's blood run cold. "I know because I've been watching since you walked in military habit." The casual mention of military experience sent a chill through the remaining bikers. They were beginning to realize that they hadn't cornered some random civilian. They'd trapped themselves in a room with someone who might be far more dangerous than they could handle. "So, here's what's going to happen," Keanu continued, his voice gaining the kind of authority that comes from absolute confidence. "You're going to make a choice. Walk away now, take your injured friends, and this ends here, or keep escalating and discover exactly how much worse this can get." The Iron Wolves stood frozen, finally understanding that they had awakened something terrible. The moment of decision hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Bulldog stood 6 feet away from Keanu, his massive hands clenched into fists, while Rick and Danny flanked him with the desperate energy of cornered animals. Snake remained pinned to the table, blood pooling beneath his face, and Pete slumped against the wall, his eyes unfocused and glassy. Frank had seen enough violence in his lifetime to recognize when a situation was about to explode beyond all control. His finger hovered over the speed dial for 911, but something told him that by the time the police arrived, there might be nothing left to investigate but bodies. "You think you're tough?" Bulldog asked, his voice carrying the forced bravado of a man trying to convince himself as much as his opponent. "You think taking down Snake and the kid makes you some kind of badass?" Keanu didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something the others couldn't hear. Perhaps the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and controlled, or the whisper of training that had been drilled into him through countless hours of preparation for roles that demanded he understand violence at its most fundamental level. "I think," Keanu said finally, "you're about to make a mistake that will change your life forever." The words weren't a threat. They were a prediction delivered with the certainty of someone who could see several moves ahead in a game the others didn't even know they were playing. Rick, nervous and sweating despite the bar's air conditioning, pulled out his cell phone. "Maybe I should call for backup. Get the rest of the club down here." "Put the phone away," Keanu said, without looking at him. "You really don't want to involve more people in this." There was something in his tone that made Rick's hand freeze midway to his pocket. It was the voice of someone who wasn't afraid of odds, no matter how overwhelming they might become. Danny, emboldened by liquid courage and pack mentality, decided that words weren't enough. He reached behind his back and pulled out a .38 revolver, pointing it directly at Keanu's chest with hands that trembled slightly. "How about now, tough guy?" Danny snarled. "Let's see how badass you are when you're looking down the barrel of my piece." The appearance of the gun shifted the entire dynamic once again. Frank ducked behind the bar, finally dialing 911 with shaking fingers. This had gone far beyond a simple bar fight. This was now life and death. But Keanu's reaction to the weapon was perhaps the most unsettling thing yet. He didn't freeze, didn't raise his hands, didn't show any of the normal human responses to having a gun pointed at him. Instead, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Danny," he said conversationally, "you just made the worst decision of your life." "Shut up," Danny screamed, his voice cracking under pressure. "I got the gun. I'm in control here. Are you?" Keanu asked, and there was something almost pitying in his voice. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like a scared kid playing with his daddy's gun." The psychological warfare was having its intended effect. Danny's hands were shaking more violently now, and sweat was beading on his forehead. Despite the cool air, Bulldog could sense his crew falling apart and decided to reassert his authority. "Danny wastes this punk. We'll dump the body in the woods, and nobody will ever know he was here." The casual discussion of murder sent a shockwave through the bar. Frank was whispering urgently into his phone, giving their location to the 911 operator, but everyone knew the police were at least 10 minutes away. And 10 minutes was an eternity in a situation like this. Snake managed to lift his head from the table, blood still streaming from his nose. "Kill him," he wheezed. "Kill him now before he—" His words were cut off as Keanu's hand pressed down on his neck again, but with more force this time. Snake's eyes bulged as his air supply was restricted. "Let me explain something to you, Keanu," said his voice taking on a quality that none of them had heard before. Cold, professional, and absolutely without mercy. "My name is John Wick." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of recognition and terror. Even in their isolated corner of the criminal world, the Iron Wolves had heard whispers of that name, stories told in hushed voices about a killer so efficient, so relentless, that entire crime families crossed themselves. When his name was mentioned, Danny's gun hand began to shake uncontrollably. "You're lying," he stammered. "John Wick is just a story, a boogeyman, am I?" Keanu asked, and now his voice carried the full weight of his reputation. "Ask yourself, How many men do you know who could do what I just did to your friends? How many men do you know who would stand perfectly still while having a gun pointed at them? Rick had gone pale as paper. Bulldog, we need to get out of here now. But Bulldog was beyond rational thought. Years of commanding through violence and intimidation had programmed him to respond to challenges with escalating aggression. The idea that he might be outmatched was simply not a concept his ego could process. I don't care if you're John Wick or John Expletive Wayne, he roared. Nobody disrespects the Iron Wolves in our own territory. He charged forward with a bellow of rage. His massive fists aimed at Keanu's head with enough force to cave in a skull. What happened next would be replayed in Danny's nightmares for the rest of his life. However long that turned out to be, Keanu moved like liquid death. He said, Bulldog's charge with minimal effort, grabbed the biker's extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing through the booth's table in an explosion of splintered wood and broken glass. The sound of the impact was sickening, bone and flesh, meeting an unyielding surface with devastating force. Bulldog lay motionless among the wreckage, his breathing shallow and labored, blood pooling beneath his head where it had struck the floor. 3 down, 2 to go. Danny's finger tightened on the trigger, but his hands were shaking so violently that he couldn't maintain a steady aim. Rick was already backing toward the door, his survival instincts finally overriding his loyalty to the club. Your move, Keanu said quietly, looking directly at Danny, but choose carefully, because once you pull that trigger, this becomes something you can't take back. And I promise you, you won't like how it ends. The final confrontation was about to begin, and everyone in the Rusty Anchor knew that some of them wouldn't live to see the morning. Danny's finger trembled on the trigger as he stared into Keanu's eyes. What he saw there wasn't the fear or desperation he expected. It was the calm certainty of a man who had faced death so many times that it no longer held any terror for him. Danny, Keanu said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Look around. Really, look. Against his better judgment, Danny's eyes flicked around the bar. Snake was still pinned to the remains of the table, barely conscious and breathing in ragged gasps. Pete slumped against the wall, a thin trail of blood running from his scalp to the floor. Bulldog lay motionless among the splintered wood and broken glass, his massive frame looking suddenly fragile and broken. 3 of your brothers, Keanu continued, and I haven't even tried yet. I've been defensive this entire time, reactive, just responding to your aggression. The words sank in with horrifying clarity. Everything they had witnessed, the lightning-fast takedowns, the precise application of force, the casual dismantling of their pack hierarchy had been restrained. But you, Keanu said, his gaze returning to Danny, you escalated this to lethal force. You pointed a gun at me, and that changes everything. Rick was edging toward the door, but Keanu's voice stopped him cold. Where are you going, Rick? The biker froze, understanding somehow that running would only make things worse. I was just... You were just leaving your friend to face the consequences of all your actions alone, Keanu finished. Interesting choice for someone who claims brotherhood. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Danny could feel sweat dripping into his eyes, making his vision blurry. His hands shook so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on the weapon. You want to know who I really am? Keanu asked, taking a single step forward despite the gun pointed at his chest. I'm the man they call when someone needs to disappear quietly. I'm the nightmare that keeps crime bosses awake at night. I'm the reason grown men check their closets before going to bed. Another step. I've killed more people than you've met in your entire life. I've taken apart entire organizations with nothing but determination and the tools at hand. I've turned everyday objects into instruments of death and buildings into tombs. The third step brought him close enough that Danny could have reached out and touched him. But you know what the difference is between me and you? Keanu asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I only kill people who deserve it. People who prey on the innocent. People who use violence to intimidate and control others. The gun barrel was now less than 2 feet from Keanu's chest, but he showed no sign of stopping. People exactly like you. Danny's nerves finally broke. He squeezed the trigger. The click of the firing pin hitting an empty chamber echoed through the bar like a death knell. You forgot to chamber around, Keanu observed with clinical detachment. Rookie mistake. Before Danny could react, Keanu's hand shot out and grabbed the revolver, twisting it from the biker's grip with a motion so fast and precise that Danny didn't even feel it until it was too late. Keanu examined the weapon briefly, then removed the bullets from the cylinder one by one, letting them fall to the floor with metallic pings that sounded like funeral bells. Cheap ammunition, he noted. Probably wouldn't have killed me anyway. Just made me angry. Danny staggered backward, his face white with terror. Please, he whispered. I didn't know. We didn't know who you were. No, Keanu agreed. You didn't. You saw what you thought was an easy target. Someone you could humiliate and brutalize for your own entertainment. You never considered that he might be a human being with feelings, with dignity, with the right to exist in peace. He placed the empty revolver on the bar with deliberate care. That's the real tragedy here. Not that you attacked John Wick, that you attacked anyone at all, because this is what you do, isn't it? This is how you operate. You find people you think are weaker than you, and you hurt them because it makes you feel powerful. Rick had pressed himself against the wall as if trying to become invisible. We're sorry, he stammered. We'll leave. We'll never bother you again. Oh, I know you won't, Keanu said with absolute certainty. Because tonight, the Iron Wolves ceased to exist. The pronunciation carried the weight of inevitability. Not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. You see, Keanu continued, when you attack John Wick, you don't just hurt one man. You send a message to every criminal organization, every street gang, every petty thug with delusions of grandeur. Maybe the boogeyman isn't so scary after all. Maybe he can be taken down by some drunk bikers in a dive bar. He moved closer to Danny, who cowered against the jukebox. And I can't let that message stand. Frank emerged from behind the bar, his face pale, but determined. The police are coming, he announced. I can hear the sirens. Keanu nodded. Good. They'll need to clean up the mess. The sirens were getting closer, but everyone in the bar understood that whatever was about to happen would be over long before the authorities arrived. So here's how this ends, Keanu said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing a sentence. You get to choose. All of you. The choice he offered would determine not just their immediate fate, but whether they lived to see another. Sunrise. The sirens were getting closer, their wailing cutting through the night air, like the cries of approaching banshees. But inside, the rusty anchor, time seemed suspended as Keanu stood before the remnants of the Iron Wolves, offering them a choice that would determine their fate. Do you want to know what separates John Wick from every other killer in the world? Keanu asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. It's not the skill, though I have that. It's not the reputation, though that precedes me. It's judgment. Danny and Rick stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might tip the scales toward their destruction. I could kill all of you right now, Keanu continued, his tone conversational despite the horrific content. With my bare hands, with improvised weapons, with tools I could fashion from what's available in this bar. I could make it look like you killed each other in a drunken brawl. The police would write it off as typical biker violence, and no one would ever know I was here. Snake managed to raise his head from the broken table, blood still streaming from his nose. Then why don't you? He wheezed. Because, Keanu said, killing you would be easy. Justice requires something more difficult. He walked over to where Bulldog lay unconscious among the wreckage of the booth. The massive biker was still breathing, but barely. A concussion certainly, possibly a skull fracture. He would need medical attention soon or risk permanent damage. "Your president here," Keanu said, nudging Bulldog's boot with his own, "has been running a protection racket for 3 years. Small businesses, elderly shop owners, immigrant families who can't afford to fight back. You've been taking their money, threatening their children, destroying their lives." The words hit Danny and Rick like physical blows. They had convinced themselves that their victims deserved what they got, that they were providing a service, that strength gave them the right to take from the weak. "How do you know that?" Rick whispered. "Because I made it my business to know," Keanu replied. "The same way I know about the drug running, the human trafficking, the murders you've committed to protect your territory. Did you think those crimes would go unnoticed forever?" Frank watched from behind the bar, realizing that this confrontation had been inevitable. The Iron Wolves had built their empire on brutality and intimidation, and eventually someone stronger and more ruthless was bound to challenge them. "Here's your choice," Keanu said, turning back to face the surviving bikers. "Option 1, I finish what you started. I make sure the Iron Wolves disappear completely, permanently, and messily. Your families will never know what happened to you, and your victims will sleep peacefully, knowing you can never hurt them again." The threat hung in the air like a blade suspended over their necks. "Option 2, Keanu continued. You live, but the Iron Wolves die anyway. You turn yourselves in to the police when they arrive. You confess to every crime, every extortion, every act of violence you've committed. You provide evidence against your criminal contacts." Danny shook his head desperately. "We can't do that. The other clubs would kill us. We'd be marked men." "You're already marked men," Keanu pointed out. "The question is whether you're marked by me or by them, I promise. My version is quicker." Pete had regained consciousness and was listening from his position against the wall. Blood matted his hair and his vision was blurry, but he understood enough to know that his life hung in the balance. "What about our families?" Pete asked weakly. "We have wives, kids. If we turn ourselves in, they'll suffer. Your families will be protected," Keanu said. "Relocated if necessary, new identities if required. But that protection comes with conditions. No contact with criminal organizations, no return to life. One violation, and the deal is off." The sirens were very close. Now, probably less than a minute away. The Iron Wolves had to make their choice quickly. Snake struggled to push himself up from the table. "You're John Wick," he said, his voice thick with blood and broken teeth. "Your word is supposed to mean something in our world." "It does," Keanu confirmed, "which is why you know I'm not lying about any of this." Rick looked around at his fallen brothers, at the destruction that had been visited upon them in less than 5 minutes. The Iron Wolves had seemed so powerful an hour ago, so unstoppable. Now they were broken men facing impossible choices. "If we choose option 2, Rick said carefully, "how do we know you won't kill us anyway? How do we know this isn't just another way to torture us?" Keanu considered the question seriously. "Unlike you, I don't take pleasure in cruelty. I do what's necessary to protect the innocent, nothing more. Your deaths would serve no purpose if you're no longer a threat." The police cars were pulling into the parking lot now. There were red and blue lights painting the bar's windows in alternating colors of authority and urgency. "Time's up," Keanu announced. "Choose." Danny was the first to break. "I confess," he sobbed. "I'll tell them everything. Just don't kill me, please." Rick nodded frantically. "Me too. We'll cooperate. We'll do whatever you want." Snake spat blood onto the floor. "You're all cowards," he snarled. "I'd rather die than rat out my brothers." "Your choice," Keanu said simply. When the police burst through the door 30 seconds later, they found a scene that defied explanation. 3 bikers were severely injured, but alive. 2 others sat quietly with their hands behind their heads, ready to surrender. And in the corner booth sat a man in a leather jacket, calmly reading a book as if nothing had happened. Officer Martinez, the first through the door, surveyed the carnage with experienced eyes. What happened here? Self-defense, Frank called out from behind the bar. They attacked the gentleman in the corner. He defended himself. The surviving Iron Wolves said nothing, waiting for their promised interrogation, where they would confess to crimes that would put them away for decades. It was better than the alternative. As the paramedics worked on the injured, and the police began taking statements, Keanu quietly finished his chapter of Meditations. The ancient emperor's words about justice and moral courage seemed particularly relevant. When Officer Martinez approached his booth, Keanu looked up with the calm expression of someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Sir, I'm going to need to get your statement about what happened here." "Of course," Keanu replied, closing his book. "I was just having a drink and reading when those gentlemen decided to start a fight. I defended myself as minimally as necessary." The officer looked around at the destruction, then back at the quiet man in the leather jacket. Something didn't add up, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. "Minimal?" Martinez asked skeptically. Keanu smiled sadly. "Officer, you should see what happens when I'm not being minimal." Outside, the rain had started again, washing the blood from the rusty Anchor's parking lot and carrying it away into the darkness. By morning there would be no trace of what had transpired here, except in the memories of those who had witnessed the night that the Iron Wolves learned the difference between predator and prey. The choice had been made. Justice had been served. And John Wick rode off into the storm, leaving behind only whispers of a legend that would grow with each telling. Some monsters, it turned out, hunted other monsters,